Hello and welcome to the Wednesday class. I'm actually filming this on Wednesday, and so I think I'm ahead of the game. I'm actually doing it on the day I'm supposed to. It's about 3:20 in the afternoon. It is a gorgeous day today, and it is promising to warm up, and as the sun slowly moves this way, I will probably become more and more in the sunlight. Before I begin, let me go ahead and open us with some prayer. Most gracious and loving God, in all that you do, you watch over us and you lead us and you guide us through our lives if we allow it. If we watch for your words, if we listen for your voice, then you lead us through life. And in all things, I ask you to give us wisdom today as we read through your scripture, as we find the words, have them have meaning to us that is beyond what we would normally understand. Give us fuller insight into your word, into your world that you have created and given to us. And in all things, we thank you and we bless you and we praise your name. Amen. Right now, in just a second here, I'm going to show you, it's about a 3.5 minute video that I captured. All it is really is kind of a recap of Judges chapter 4. Before we get into Judges chapter 5, which is what we're going to talk about today, is the Song of Deborah and Barak, which is chapter 5, all 31 verses. Today's class might get a little long. We're just going to have to see how far along I get before I decide that we have talked, or I have talked, too long. Today's lesson might be a little long. One of the other things you're going to probably note today is that I'm going to present this lesson a little differently than I normally do because this is poetry. And poetry is different than prose. And so I'm going to present this a little bit differently than I would normally do this, than you're used to, I think. It's not normally this is normally how I would do this, but so far, well, you weren't here for when I did Judges a long time ago. So this is poetry, and I will treat poetry a little different when we begin the discussion. So there's going to be a very short video starting now.
Deborah and Barak's duet, Judges 4 and 5. The people of Israel were ignoring God's commands. Because Israel was worshiping idols, God had allowed the Canaanites to rule over them. A Canaanite general named Sisera terrorized Israel for 20 years. The Israelites were defenseless against Sisera, who commanded 900 iron chariots. Realizing they were helpless, the Israelites finally cried out to God for help. Deborah was Israel's judge at that time. She often sat under a palm tree near her home, and there the people came to her to settle their arguments. One day, she sent for a military leader named Barak. When he came, she asked him a question. "Hasn't God already told you what to do?" she asked. "Gather 10,000 soldiers and prepare for battle. God has promised to bring Sisera, his army, and his iron chariots to the Kishon River. There, God will give you the victory." Barak was fearful and answered, "Are you going to come too? Because I won't go unless you agree to come with me." "Yes, I'll go with you," Deborah agreed, "but understand that you will not get the credit for killing Sisera. Instead, God will give the honor of taking Sisera's life to a woman." Barak gathered his 10,000 troops and went up Mount Tabor. When Sisera heard that Barak was gathering men to fight, Sisera moved his army and all 900 iron chariots near the Kishon River, just as God had said. Deborah announced to Barak, "Go now. The Lord has given Sisera into your hand today. Has not God already gone out before you to help you?" Barak and his men charged down from Mount Tabor, and as the Israelites advanced, God confused Sisera's army. God sent a powerful rainstorm that soaked the ground and caused the river to flood. Sisera's chariots sank deep into the mud. They were stuck and completely useless. Sisera's men tried to run from the Israelites, but the Israelites caught them and killed them. The flooded river carried other soldiers away. Every single one of Sisera's men died that day. Meanwhile, Sisera had jumped out of his chariot to run for his life. Sisera knew that the Canaanites were at peace with a man named Heber. Sisera headed straight for Heber's tents. Heber's wife Jael saw Sisera rushing toward the tents. "Come inside my tent," Jael invited. "Don't be afraid." Jael was being nice to Sisera, but she really considered him her enemy. Sisera hurried into the tent, and Jael covered him with a blanket and gave him some milk to drink. Sisera said, "Stand in the doorway of the tent, and if someone asks you if any man is in here, tell him no." Sisera was so worn out that he quickly fell asleep. Jael quietly moved over to him and killed him with a hammer and a tent peg before he had a chance to wake up. Then Jael waited outside the tent for Barak. "Come with me," Jael called to Barak, "and I will show you the man you're looking for." Barak followed her into the tent. To his surprise, he saw Sisera lying dead on the tent floor. The honor for killing Sisera went to a woman, just as God had promised.
Well, wasn't that fun? Okay, we're going to begin our Song of Deborah and Barak, chapter 5, verses 1 through 31. Kind of an overview again, kind of a recap. The Song of Deborah and Barak is quite, by a lot of scholars, considered one of the oldest pieces of literature in our Hebrew text. There's a lot of debate about when it was actually written, when it was written down. There's two schools of thought of that. One of them, it was during the time of David, when all of the stories were starting to be collected. And that's one of the theories about when this particular poem came into existence. And the other one is that it was compiled or written during the time of the exile. And we've had this discussion before, but I am honestly I honestly believe in my own heart that, again, this is a piece of poetry that dates back to the oral tradition, and that sometime during David's reign or shortly thereafter, during the consolidation of the two empires, or the two sides, the northern and the southern kingdoms, the two different kingdoms, as they were being consolidated during David's time and maybe even all the way into Solomon's time, a lot of these stories, or a lot of these poetry, a lot of the stories were collected, which kind of became the foundation of what was later done during the exile, when all of these stories were recompiled again and redacted, changed, altered, moved, and maybe even in some cases created. But that's kind of my rundown of when this is. And so I'm going to place this in time. Well, if we were to place it in a historical time, as the time whereas when the story presents itself to be, it would be sometime between 1300 and 1500 BC. So about 4,000 years ago, give or take some. Somewhere around that, about 3,500 to 3,500 years ago. Somewhere in there is when this was, when these stories were, if not, is when these stories take place. That's when they are in the historical context. Whether these actually are historical, it's a whole different debate. All right, enough of my rambling about the origin of these. These are considered some of the oldest. Scholars look at these and look at this as one of the oldest pieces of our Hebrew text. And as this song progresses forward, as it unfolds in the poetic account of the battles between Israel and Sisera, which we just reviewed from Judges chapter 4, the dominance of Deborah and the concluding focus on the two women related to Sisera's death. At the end, there's another woman that's brought into the story. There are three powerful women that are brought into the story. This is really a lot of evidence of the female perspective of Judges chapter 5. In contrast to a much more male perspective of Judges chapter 4. In this poetic version of that story, there's a lot of the details are missing from the earlier prose version, in this poetic version. but new elements, new parts of the story are added. And so we learn new things while some of the other details were dropped out. And so that's just kind of an interesting thing, is that the poem brings out more story detail, but also leaves out some story detail. At regular intervals through this poem, at regular intervals, the account here, this poem is intertwined very creatively with a series of exhortations, and they're both spoken by both the singer and a congregation that exhort and express the praise of Adonai, and it also calls for the defeated foes to listen and reflect, and there's also a declaration of curses and blessings on various participants in the story here, the different tribes, as well with how well they participate or don't participate in this particular campaign. This song is not just a song about praising Yahweh. It's also, as historic poetry, one that blesses and curses the human characters as they are present or absent in this deliverance story. Okay, enough of that. Beginning now with chapter 5. Verse 1. On that day, Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang this song. And that's where we're going to stop. So now this is kind of the introduction to the poem. And so on the day of victory, Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang this song. So after providing after our prose version of chapter 4, our narrator now inserts a poetic rehearsal of the story. Our storyteller inserts this poetic version of the story, and it's linked to Barak and to Deborah. Well, in doing this, the narrator is following a particular pattern that was established back in Exodus. And I think I mentioned this last week, where the victory, back in Exodus, it's in chapter, this is in chapter 14 and 15 of Exodus. And in that, the story unfolds in chapter 14, and then in chapter 15 of Exodus is the Song of Miriam, or the Song of Victory, that happens right after the victory at the Sea of Reeds. They cross through the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, and they get to the other side. Victory is declared because the Pharaoh's army is destroyed, and Miriam sings a song. And the congregation, the people, join in with this song. And this is exactly the same thing that is happening here. This is part of that pattern that we see. We'll also see this same pattern reflected with Mary in the Song of Mary, and also there is one other place. There's one other place. I think it's the Song of Hannah, where again a victory is being proclaimed, and in both of those cases, both Hannah and again in Mary, it is not about a victory in war, but so much as a victory in peace. It moves them forward into a new way of being, and again, there's a new victory or a new way of living. So that's kind of the pattern, and this one fits into that pattern. In that very first line, on that day, Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang this song by placing Deborah first. And the main verb in that sentence is the word sang. And so placing Deborah and forming the main verb in relation to her, sang, Barak is again identified as the passive character and Deborah as the active character. Same thing it was back in chapter 4. We also saw that same pattern. I don't know if I pointed it out then, but Deborah, in all of the places where Deborah enters the story or is part of the story, she is the active one, and Barak is much more passive. And so in this poem, it is Deborah herself who speaks, and it's in the first person. And she's she either speaks in the first person or is either addressed and listed first. So what that points to is that the folly of Barak's timidity is shown here, and it gives another example also in this of the ineptitude. As we move forward, we'll also see there's more examples of the failure of leadership of the northern kingdom's leaders. Mostly it has to do with Ephraim is very pointedly picked on almost throughout all of the book of Judges. The tribe of Ephraim is picked on pretty heavily. And that's because the tribe of Ephraim is supposed to be the first tribe. That's that's Joseph's tribe. That's the tribe from in fact, the northern kingdom, the northern territory is known as Ephraim, the whole thing, for a short period of time. And again, I think I mentioned that before. Okay, moving on now to our chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. When the princes of Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. Hear this, you kings. Listen, you rulers. I will sing to the Lord. I will sing. I will make music to the Lord, the God of Israel. So a double refrain appears at 2 points in the poem. Here, and again in verses 9 through 11, the first half of verse 11 through verse 11a. The first component in this refrain, it praises Yahweh with reference to those Israelites who volunteered for this battle, thus preparing the way for the glorification of the tribes that gathered, as well as the questioning and cursing of those who did not respond to the call. So those that didn't respond to the call in verse 9, they're the ones on the receiving end of this cursing, and we'll see this as we move forward. The second component, which is in verse 3, and it addresses a third party, and it either expresses the singer's desire to sing praise, or in verses 10 through 11a, issues a call to sing praise to Yahweh. See, they're a little bit different, but both of them are calling to Yahweh. These two refrains highlight the two subjects of this praise song: the divine and the human warriors who responded to Israel's predicament. The kings and rulers in view here in this part here, back in verse 3, hear this, you kings, listen, you rulers. They are the conquered Canaanites in this passage. There is a little note here I want to. When it says here, where is that there? In verse 2 there. When the princes in Israel take the lead. The Hebrew and the Greek in this passage consistently associates this with leaving something unattended. And sometimes in some of the passages through Scripture and through other places in this, it has a relationship to letting one's hair hang loosely. And there are some scholars who are suggesting that the view here is of gathering up of the hair prior to battle. It means you gather your hair up and you put it in a knot, or you put something in your hair to hold it together. And so that the idea of the when the princes take the lead, actually it's when the princes do up their hair getting ready for battle would be a much more literal translation of that particular passage, which I kind of, well, for me, that's kind of interesting here, as the idea is to gather up your hair so you can go and fight. Okay, moving on to verses 4 and 5. O Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down rain. The mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai, before the Lord, the God of Israel. So this account here, our poetic account here begins with a heavenly perspective. And so it traces out a heavenly perspective, and and also gives precedent to Yahweh's activity, to Adonai's activity as the divine warrior. This emphasis can also be seen or discerned in that even when the singers praise the human warrior, in the first refrain, verses 2a and b, and verses 9a and b, they conclude with the declaration, praise or bless the Lord. Again, that's correlation between verses 2 and verse 9 in this poem. This declaration sets the tone for the account of the battle in verses 19 through 22, which will show that it is an action of the heavenly armies and bodies that determine the outcome rather than the strength of the human armies. And we'll see that as we get into verses 19 through 22 toward the end of this hymn. It shows that the divine beings or the divine steps into the story, into the fray, and that's when victory is there. As is normal or typical in these kinds of stories or in these kinds of depictions of stories, the march of the divine warrior is marked by earthquakes and famine, or earthquakes and fire and there's always some sort of convulsion in creation. So there's earthquakes and there's rainstorms, and there's the noise, and that is of course symbolic of divine action, is when there's thunder and lightning, because God is moving. And that's kind of how, that's how they reviewed it. And it's not coincidental that in the Canaanite context, their understanding, it was Baal, B-A-A-L, Baal, or Baal, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that's the God who rode in the clouds and controlled the rain and the thunder and the lightning. So according to this song, Yahweh, or Adonai, plays that role. And so what we have is, again, the conflict of the gods is being presented here, where Adonai, our God, is taking on or has showing stronger aspects to what the opposing God has. In this case, Baal is supposed to be the one that has all this power, and yet Yahweh is demonstrating that Adonai, Yahweh, has that power. It also has Adonai appearing to the ancient mountain ranges. Here and in this part of this, they're identified with the regions of Edom and the Sinai. This is not unusual. This is evident also with God, with Adonai appearing as a divine warrior in Deuteronomy in chapter 33, verse 2, where he's accompanied by myriad of holy ones and is identified as the God who rides on the heavens on the clouds of his majesty. That's 33, verse 26 of Deuteronomy. In order to drive out Israel's enemy, in verse 27, and trampled down the high places in verse 29. Let's take about a 5-minute break. It won't be that for you, but it will be for me. I'm going to take about a 5-minute break, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. Picking up now with verses 6 through 8. You ready? Here we go. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the roads were abandoned. Travelers took to winding paths. Village life in Israel ceased until I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel. When they chose new gods, war came to the city gates, and not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. So, here in verses 6 and 8, or 6 through 8, it tells us of the predicament of Israel. And it traces our story to the time of Shamgar, which is found at the end of chapter 3. I think it's the very last. In fact, Shamgar is the last judge listed in chapter 3. And I don't know if I told you then, but Shamgar is not recognized as actually being a Hebrew, as actually being an Israelite. And so that's just kind of a little interesting little side note here, is that, well, I don't know. We'll process that. And in the fact that Ehud's death is noted here at the beginning of this account of Deborah and Barak in verses 4:1, that is also back in 4:1, it suggests to us, or it tells us, that Shamgar's activity, that he was a contemporary of Deborah and Barak. So he was alive during the same time, or was a judge during the same time of Deborah and the war chief Barak. In fact, that's kind of what chapter 1 of our verse 1 of chapter 4 suggests to us, and so that kind of makes sense here in the close association between Shamgar and Jael that we find here in verse 6 of chapter 5. It's kind of interesting that these two individuals were chosen to set the context for the predicament. These two are unlikely saviors for Israel, both being foreigners who act in Israel's behalf. Israel's desperation in this time, in this period, it creates space for the rise of Deborah. So, what we're seeing here is village life in Israel ceased until I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel. What this is a description of disruption of transportation, the stifling of the rural activity, the ability to travel from one place to another. Now, most of the time, most travel during these times was and even later, and even a lot of times, even all the way to today, the most travel is actually by commerce. We find much more travel by commerce. So it not only made it difficult for people to visit others because of what was happening on the roads. The roads were not very safe. Is that the Hebrew word here, as it's understood by the translators, indicates that the village economic life has come to an end. But it also has the meaning of to cease doing, to refrain from doing. And just stop. We're just going to stop. We're just not going to deal with this crisis. We're just going to stop. We're going to just hunker down at home. And that's kind of what they did. That's how they dealt with this crisis of bandits on the road, of people pillaging, or highway taxes, things like this that were causing a disruption of the economic life of what was going on around there. And so they just kind of, all right, well, we're just going to stay home. And they did this, and that's how they dealt with the crisis until the rise of Deborah, until she came along. And there in verse 8, at the end of that, and not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000. That shows a lack of military equipment. And that just they didn't even show up at the gate with weapons at all. They did not carry a shield or spear. Was among the 40,000 in Israel. None of them were carrying a shield or a spear. They came to the war without weapons, without equipment. And this is just kind of the depth of the oppression that they were under, that they just didn't even have these things. And so, as we understood it now, and as we look at things then, the transportation, as I had already said, was mostly for economic purposes. And what this also suggested us is the Canaanites had stifled caravan traffic. They had stifled traffic through the area, commerce through the area, through the plains of Jezreel. And it was probably, or most likely, because they were extorting the travelers or having exorbitant tolls on the road. And so what it also shows here is that they abandon the more convenient and the major roadways, and instead they start following the more difficult twisting paths to other destinations, to where they needed to go. They started following the goat trails instead of the main roads. That way they didn't have to deal with this crisis. They didn't have to deal with what was happening to them, what Caesarea was doing to them. And so that was kind of how they dealt with it, by ignoring the problem or moving around the problem. So this is the context in which Deborah arises. She arises and as a mother in Israel, as we will see as we move to that part of the poem, that she describes herself as a mother in Israel, and so that suggested that she's life-giving, and this is maternal care for a defenseless people. We see a reference to choosing, well, here we have it here, when they chose new gods, verse 8. The reference to choosing new ones, or new gods in this particular case, and in other translations it's new ones. It's very ambiguous in the Hebrew. And it can be, or it could be translated as Israel chooses new gods. He, Israel, chooses new gods. Which is how kind of the NIV has done it. When they chose, Israel chose new gods. I guess what this does is it throws it into doubt as to what this actually means. Because the NIV translation is possible, and though in that way it references Israel's disobedience, depicted as their at the outset of Judges in chapter 4, where they started following other gods, and so that is suggestive of that. But it also, the use of the singular verb in this, in the Hebrew, also suggests that it's God doing the choosing rather than the people. And this choosing follows from the rise of Deborah. And so, not mentioning Barak, it plays down his role. So there's a question about that. When they chose new gods, war came to the city gates. It could also be when God chose new leaders, war came to the city gates. And so, again, it can go either way, depending on which translation or understanding you want to have. Okay, moving on. Verses 9 through 11, and the first half of verse 11. So we're going to say in verses 9 through 11a. So, beginning with verse 9. My heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people. Praise the Lord. You who ride on white donkeys, sitting on your saddle blankets, and you who walk along the road, consider the voice of the singers at the watering places. They recite the righteous acts of the Lord, the righteous acts of his warriors in Israel. So, echoing the style and vocabulary that we found back in verse 2 and 3, this song breaks off from the account for a moment to call the audience to praise Yahweh on account of the actions of the leaders and warriors and the victory, the righteous deeds that has been won by Yahweh. So, just as we have back in verses 2 and 3, here's where we have another exhortation about God, and this one is the bless the Lord and sing. So this also addresses, as we look through this also addresses the ones that are riding on the white donkeys, sitting on cloth and traveling on the road. And this probably is a reference to the same royal figures that are addressed on the roadways back in verse 6. Or it could also be those people whose trade has been encumbered or has been blocked by the Canaanite taxation. It's probably not coincidental that the donkeys are associated with royal figures in the Old Testament. We see that in Genesis chapter 49, verse 11. We also find it in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, that royalty rides on a donkey. If that doesn't bring you to the day Jesus comes into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, again, that is exactly what that reference is both to Genesis 49:11, to Zechariah 9:9. Also, this would be part of that that collection of stories or collection of ideas that have royalty riding on a donkey. In this here also, the reader, the hearer, the listener, the audience is, we're called on to reflect on the righteous deeds of Adonai, and that are being recited by the peasantry while they're watering their flocks. And so part of this is that we are supposed to do that also, and to see that. And so I want to look at the word in this. There is one word here that I want to kind of highlight, and it's the word consider, which is right at the tail end of verse 10 before you get to verse 11. In the poetry, it's actually, the word consider should be in verse 11, but it's the way it's written, it's laid out wrong, but that's all right. We're going to work with it as it is. But I want to talk about a little bit, just very briefly. There's a little note here that I want to bring out on the word consider, and this word is used to either describe loud or in other places in Scripture. The word is used to describe the word either loud, enthusiastic, emotionally laden speech, and like in Psalm 105 verse 2, where it's used as praise. The word in Job, chapter 7, is used as a lament. The word in Psalm 69, it's a word of taunting. And in Psalm 6, or in Proverbs 6, it's a song of teaching, or a word that's used for teaching, consider. And so, the earlier refrain, the earlier exhortation back in verse 3, called on the audience to hear and listen. And what that does is it's suggesting that what is in view here is meditation with thanks and praise. But it's also possible that the first refrain, back in verse 3, the poet is calling the audience to hear and listen, and here now it is to speak. And so in the previous one it could be hear, listen, and now it's speak, where in the previous one it was to hear and listen, and then meditation with thanks and praise. And so we have two different variants of this on how the word is used. I kind of like the second one here, where the first one calls you to hear and listen, and the second one calls us to speak. Speak the voice of the singers at the watering places instead of consider the voice. And I kind of like that idea. Okay, picking up now with chapter 5, verse 11b, the second half to verse 11. Then the people of the Lord went down to the city gates. Okay. Before we broke away into verses 9 through 11, the exhortation, the poet had been describing or depicting a weaponless army facing war at the city gates. As the poetic account resumes here, for the brief moment in verse 11b, the army has gone down to meet the enemy at the city gates. So, now, picking up verse 12. Wake up! Wake up, Deborah! Wake up! Wake up! Break out in song! Arise, O Barak! Take captive your captives, O son of Abinoam. The account here is interrupted for a brief moment again, as Deborah and Barak are now exhorted by another voice. Possibly now of those who Deborah has been exhorting to praise throughout the song. Verses 2, verses 9, Deborah is exhorting people to praise. They call Deborah to awake and declare a song, and Barak to lead away the defeated captives. This exhortation assumes the successful completion of the battle, the context in which this victory song is being sung. Now verses 13 through 18. Then the men who were left came down to the nobles. The people of the Lord came to me with the mighty. Some came from Ephraim, whose roots were in Amalek. Benjamin was with the people who followed you. From Machir, captains came down. From Zebulun, those who bear a commander's staff. The princes of Issachar were with Deborah. Yes, Issachar was with Barak, rushing after him into the valley. In the districts of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. Why did you stay among the campfires to hear the whistling of the flocks? In the districts of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did you linger by the ships? Asher remained on the coast and stayed in his coves. The people of Zebulun risked their very lives. So did Naphtali on the heights of the field. So the account resumes again here in this section in verses 13 through 18, identical in fashion to the way it was resumed earlier from 511b. Here people are depicted as the remnants fleeing from defeat in battle. They rally to the nobles as an army of mighty warriors. Then the men who were left came down to the nobles. The people of the Lord came to me with the mighty. So some came from Ephraim. So the warriors came from a lot of the different tribes and clans, including Ephraim, Benjamin, Machir, that's a name you don't know, Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali. Those are found in verses 14 through 15 and verse 18. The idea or the fact that they're all northern tribe, it accords very well with the threat that is from Canaanite kings from the north. It's from the northern regions in Israel. And right in the middle of all of this account of the assembling of the troops, the poet throws, he throws shade. He contrasts those tribes and clans who refused to join, and the tribes in the coalition, those that refused to join the coalition and those that did join the coalition. The ones that did not join the coalition are Reuben, Gilead, Dan, and Asher. And so, let's see if we can figure out some of these names. The name of Machir and Gilead, both of those names kind of stand out as a list of names since they're not part of the original tribal names. They're not Benjamin and Dan and Naphtali and Zebulun and Asher and all of those. It's none of those. These are different names. Machir and Gilead. And so they kind of stand out a little bit as being, that's not the normal list of tribal lists. Now, if you go back to Joshua chapter 17, verses 1 through 3, the Transjordan region, that's the side on the other side from the promise, out there it's still part of, in today's world it'd be part of Jordan, I think, but it's on the other side of the Jordan River, that's called the Transjordan. And those are regions of Gilead and Bashan. The regions of Gilead and Bashan were given to Manasseh's firstborn son, Machir. He was the father of Gilead. So Machir and Gilead are both reflecting the the tribe of Manasseh. Remember Ephraim and Manasseh. And in fact, if you look at the map, and I will provide you a map now. If you look at that map, you'll see that Manasseh is divided up into two sections. There's a Transjordan side, and then there's in the Promised side. And the same thing with who's the other one? There's another one there. I think it's Gad is on the other side also. Those are on the Transjordan side. You can look them up. They're on the map as we look at this. Okay, so according to Joshua, those two, Gilead, in the region of Gilead, Manasseh's firstborn son Machir was given the property. And he named his son after the region that he was given. He's the father of Gilead, and Gilead is also a place. So, what it really does is it shows that these two clans, Machir and Gilead, are reflecting the presence or the non-presence of Manasseh. And so there, because if you look at that list, Reuben, Gilead, Dan, and Asher, Manasseh is missing from that list of northern tribes that are involved in all of this. So by naming those two, it's actually telling us that the Manassehites are not part of this. And so while there's that link between Machir and Manasseh, it may also be that the mentioning of the reference to Gilead also could be mentioning the missing tribe of Gad, which again is in southern Gilead, just north of Reuben, and it's mentioned in the previous verse, and so it could be part of that. And according to Numbers chapter 32, Deuteronomy chapter 3, and Joshua chapter 13, the land of Gilead was apportioned to both half tribe of Manasseh and to Gad. So both of those are missing from the list. Then the only two that are left missing on our list of brothers that are part of this, of tribes, is Judah and Simon. Well, all that really tells us is that this was a northern battle, not a southern battle. If it was down in the south, then Judah and Simon would be involved. But Judah and Simon are not involved, so that just further lends the idea that this is a northern battle. And so throughout the book of Judges, we're going to see that Ephraim is always presented as the leader of the northern tribes. And it also shows up, and we get this idea from Judges based on the actions of chapter 1, verses 22 through 26, and then the expectations voiced that we hear later in chapters 8 and 12. There's a lot of expectation about the leadership of Ephraim. And although Ephraim is mentioned first, that it's almost surprising that little insignificant Machir and Zebulun are associated with leadership, and that Issachar, the tribe most closely associated with leadership of Deborah and Barak. And here, as in elsewhere in Judges, Joshua's Ephraimite tribe is denigrated. And so again, we have that going back to verse 14. Some came from Ephraim whose roots were in Amalek. And I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. In fact, I think that's, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But what we have is that if you'll notice here that it's Benjamin with the people who followed you from Machir, and of course Machir, that would be Manasseh. So from Manasseh, captains came down. From Zebulun, those who bear a commander's staff. So those are the leaderships. So captains came out of Manasseh, and a commander came out of Zebulun. But the princes, the actual war chiefs, are Deborah. Deborah's the judge, but she's really kind of the leader here. And her war chief, of Barak is from Issachar, and that's the leadership. And from there, the rest of them are not involved. Reuben, Gilead, Dan, Manasseh, or Reuben, Dan, Transjordan, Manasseh, and Gad, and Asher are not. And so, that verse, I want to talk about that very quickly, about the word Amalek. It's interesting is that the Septuagint reads that the people of Ephraim wreaked vengeance on them in your brother Benjamin's valley among your peoples. That's how that verse is read. People of Ephraim wreaked vengeance on them in your brother Benjamin's valley among your peoples. That's completely different than some came from Ephraim whose roots were in Amalek, Benjamin with his people who followed you. And that's because of the word, the root to the word Amalek. The phrase here is unclear, and it would be better to view this word here as that the word that is used, the word that's a problem, is instead of the word roots here, where we have whose roots were in Amalek, we could have another translation of that. In fact, the Hebrew translation of that, if we were to go to the Tanakh, their version of Judges, you'd see that there's a similarity in the Hebrew letters, and instead of the word roots, it should be the word chieftains, and went down to the valley. And the Hebrew is MK instead of MLK. And so it could be just a very simple transposition error, or not but a scribal error where a letter is left out. But what that did is it made that entire passage a little uncertain. Even in the Tanakh, it's a little uncertain. Okay, in this passage, verses 13 through 18, the poet emphasizes also down here in verse, it begins in verse, 15b, the second half of verse 15. Here the poet emphasizes Reuben's failure by it actually puts right at the center of this poem, this particular section of poem, Reuben is right in the middle of it. And his, it's kind of a mocking question in verse 16 there. Why did you stay among the campfires to hear the whistling of the flocks? That's a mocking question. And what it does is it points to the indecision of Reuben, how they thought about going, they were searching their heart about whether they should go or not, and they eventually decide to not go. Instead, they stayed home and listened to their sheep whistle. So again, there's that little bit of mockingness there. One of the other things too in this is that Gilead, Dan, Asher, Gilead, Dan. Gilead, Dan, and Asher are the three that are mentioned next, and they're all mentioned in relations to bodies of water. Gilead is across the Jordan. Dan is on the southern Mediterranean coast, and Asher is on the northern Mediterranean coastline. So, of course, this also reflects a period prior to Dan's migration to the far north, which we will find much later in Judges in chapters 17 and 18. Right now, in fact, if you look at the map, you'll see that Dan, or the first map, if you go back and look at it, I'm not going to show it to you again, you'll note that Dan is like down in the middle of the whole thing. Well, there's a second map that I'll show you here shortly, I think, and that second map shows that Dan also occupies a place in the far north. The place in the far north was where they were supposed to be, but they weren't able to conquer that, and that's described earlier. They weren't able to take that territory, and so they kind of settled down lower, and then toward the end of Judges, they actually occupy that part of the northern territories. And so But what we have here is that Gilead and Dan and Asher are all, in some ways they're reflected here as relating to water. And so all three of these tribes in some ways were kind of removed from this threat of Jabin and Sisera, because they were more, let's say, monetarily or economically intertwined with the Canaanites. Being along the coast, they would be much more likely to be having trade come in and out, and so they would have a different relationship with the locals because they were good for trade. And so they had a kind of an integrated economy with their neighbors, and so they decided to stay at home instead of fighting the Canaanites. They were part of the Canaanite economic system or economy. And so as part of how the poet, the author here, brings out the contrast between those who participated in the battle and those who ignored the call, the poet ends this section with a courageous, with talking about the courageous risk of Zebulun and Naphtali in the battle itself. This focus, of course, foreshadows the next phase in the account, which is the actual battle, which is verses 19 through 21a. Picking up now with verse 19 through 21a. Kings came, they fought. The kings of Canaan fought. At Tanach, by the waters of Megiddo, but they carried off no silver, no plunder. From the heavens the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away, the age-old river, the river Kishon. So, what follows here, the next section here, is the poetic account of the battle itself, as was described in chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. Now, while chapter 4 focused mostly on the exploits of Sisera, without losing sight of Sisera, the poem reminds us of the royal forces behind Sisera. Their defeat is shown by the lack of silver or the lack of plunder, and foreshadows the hope of Sisera's mother at the end of the poem, which we'll get to in verses 28 through 30. The narrative in chapter 40, the prose writing in chapter 4, it speaks only of the battle at the Kishon River, but the poem identifies the location as Taanach, by the waters of Megiddo. Taanach was an ancient Canaanite royal town, and it's usually associated today with the Tel Ti'anak. And it's in the foothills of the southern edge of the Jezreel Valley, that overlooks the seasonal swamps caused by the poor drainage of the Kishon River. And so Megiddo is located about 5 miles northwest along that same edge of the foothills. But you see here that in the story here, as the river, the heavens fight, the stars fight, the river doesn't flow smoothly enough. It doesn't drain quickly enough, and so the chariots get bogged down, and the troops get swept away. And so as the story progresses here, the narrative describes Sisera as fleeing from his chariot on foot. That's back in chapter 4, verse 15. And that the poem emphasizes the key role played by the Kishon. Right here, in our passage here, it shows us that the Kishon actually had an active role in this, in that it swept them away. And so that's just kind of a... and so that suggests that the Canaanite chariots were, of course, incapacitated by the swamp, and by the swampy ground that they were in. And interestingly enough, and here is where the poetry of the poetry of the author, the poetry of the poem describing how God works in this, is that this is referenced by the age-old river and to the stars fighting from heaven against Sisera. And this highlights the role not of Barak and his warriors, but instead of rather the divine warrior of God, of Adonai, who marches from, and here's where we get this, he marches from Seir, Edom, and the Sinai, which if you go back again to verses 4 and 5, back in verses 4 and 5, God has again manipulated the world, manipulated the natural course of things, and the image of stars fighting. It could be a meteorite shower, shooting stars, as they appear elsewhere in other Middle Eastern literature. We also see things like stories like that in Matthew. There's this one here in Judges. Also, there's the Gebel Barkal, which is the stele of Thutmose III of Egypt. That also notes how the stars help defeat the enemy, defeat an enemy, and so that's just kind of it puts it back into the cosmic realm. And so now we moving forward again, we have the second half of verse 21, and this again is an exhortation. And it is, so verse 21, the second half of verse 21 is, "March on, my soul, be strong." And so for a moment, there's a break in this account here, and the singer calls on her soul to march on in strength. And again, this is Deborah's voice is what we're supposed to be hearing, mixed in with an accompaniment of choir and Barak. And so it's a duet with a choir in the background. And so now picking up with verse 22. "Then thundered the horses' hooves, galloping, galloping go his mighty steeds." Returning to the account very briefly, again the poet describes the thundering of horses' hooves. Those mighty steeds are in view here. Whose mighty steeds are in view here is very uncertain. Whether those are from the chariots of Sisera's army, most likely, freed from their burdens, and now they're mired in the swamp of Kishon. Or is it Yahweh's divine army, that thundering horses' hooves, the galloping, his mighty steeds? Is it God's divine army? The Hebrew verb here used for beating is of Sisera's horses' hooves. It in some ways foreshadows Jael's fatal blow down in verse 26. I say that because both of them are the same word. Both of them have the same root. Hooves, home, HLM, and Jael's fatal blow is also HLM, and so there's a connection of these two words. Just also for the Hebrew in us, it's midaharat daharat, midaharat daharat, midaharat daharat, and that means galloping. And so it is a onomatopoeia by sounding out the noise of the horses galloping, and the repetition in the poem of the galloping it creates an intensity to the story, and so that's part of the poetic element of this. Which I really kind of enjoy. And now we have another exhortation. So as we see is we have an account, and then we have an exhortation, then we have an account, and then we have an exhortation, then we have an account, then we have an account, then we have an exhortation. And so that's kind of the pattern that we have of this poem. And so now we have another exhortation, and in verse 23. "Curse Miraz, said the angel of the Lord. Curse its people bitterly, because they did not come to help the Lord against the mighty." So the battle is complete, and with the battle complete, the poem again returns to the earlier focus of those who did not respond, who didn't come out to the muster that Deborah and Barak has called for. Meroz is most likely a town, but it's not mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament. And so while verses 16 and 17 here merely questions and describes those who didn't participate in the battle with Deborah and Barak, Meroz here is cursed by the angel of the Lord for not joining Yahweh in the battle, or joining Adonai in the battle. So this curse kind of serves as an important function at this point in the poem by standing exactly in contrast to the blessing which is about to be pronounced on Jael in the following verse. Verse 24. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed of tent-dwelling women. So here in verse 24, the curse against Meroz back in verse 23 is twinned with a blessing of Jael in verse 24. And is probably a continuation of the same speech of the angel of the Lord that began in verse 23. Meroz is representative of those in Israel who did not join in the coalition to defend the compatriots, the heroes of the story. And so we are also to draw this in contrast to this foreign woman, Jael, who is blessed for her courageous act, as it's described in the next two verses, verses 25, or the next three verses, 25, 26, and 27. So these two exhortations, verses 23 and 24, they serve as a segue into the final installment of this account, which will seal forever Deborah's prophecy that was back in verse 4, or chapter 4, verse 9, that the human honor that's due that's going to be passed out for this victory will go to a woman. So picking up now with verse 25 through 27, the death of Sisera. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank. He fell, and there he lay. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. So this whole account concludes here by focusing on the death of Sisera. It puts in juxtaposition the perspectives of the two women who would have played an important part or important role at the time of his death. His killer, Jael, and as we'll see next in verse 28 through 30, his mother. And Jael plays an important role in this narrative in Judges chapter 4, where she delivers the fatal blow to Sisera, commander of the Jabin's army. There she invites desperate Sisera, fresh from his defeat, into her tent, and when he asks for water, she gives him milk. Jael promises to conceal his presence from anyone who asks, and when he finally falls asleep, she violently kills him by driving a tent peg through his temple. These same details are, of course, incorporated into the poem, but now with a greater flourish that draws the reader into the violent scene. The poet describes in detail the rich constitution of the milk. It was curdled. It had so much cream in it. It was a curdled milk. The elegance of the container in which it was served. It was a bowl fit for nobles, and so both of those things contrast what's to follow, which is the crushing of Sisera's head, the shattering and piercing of his temple, and what appears to be a slow-motion death scene as his body reacts to the violence of the blow to his head. The repetition of the words in verse 27, it not only provides emphasis, but it also slows down the pace of the story, so that at the climax we move into a kind of a slow motion. The poet wants the reader actually to visualize the enemy gradually falling to the ground under the rain of blows from Jael's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. He fell at her feet, he sank, he fell, and there he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. Picking up now with verse 28 through 30. Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried out, "Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed?" The wisest of her ladies answered her, "Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, are they not finding and dividing the spoils, a girl or two for each man, colorful garments as plunder for Sisera, colorful garments embroidered, highly embroidered garments for my neck, all this as plunder?" So immediately after experiencing the violent death of the unsuspecting Sisera with Jael's humble tent peg, the reader is transported by the poet to the palace of Sisera's mother, from where she peers through her window, awaiting the arrival from the battle. The poet voices her nervous question as she ponders the delay of both his chariot and that of his warriors, his contingent. She's a woman of means, served by handmaidens, but her wealth and status are based on the success of her son in battles such as the one which he has yet to return from. So the question in verse 30 is voiced by her handmaiden, but it's also on her mind as well. And it represents the possibility of a favorable answer to her original question. He's delayed by the quantity and the quality of the plunder. And among all of that plunder will be valuable items that will make up for all the worry that is caused by the present delay. So as this plunder, she's holding out the hope that what's really delaying him from arriving is that he's making, that he's gathering up plunder. And I've got to say this because it's part of this here that. Verse 30 there, are they not finding and dividing the spoils, a girl or two for each man? Now, the Hebrew here, a girl or two, the Hebrew here is both singular and plural, and it usually refers to, and it's interestingly enough, it usually refers to a woman's womb. And here, it's a crude reference to the sexual abuse of women captured in spoil. So this text is dripping with sarcasm in the contrast between Sisera's supposed rape of the conquered and his violent demise at the feet of a courageous woman. So the readers here are left with a question ringing in their ears, a question for which they know the answer, since we've just witnessed in all of its glory, or all of its gory detail, the brutal death of this woman's only hope in that world. This final character is the third maternal character after Deborah and Jael identified in this poem. The feminine trio accentuates the comedy and tragedy of this account, highlighting women's role as either good or bad mother. Verse 31, in the first half. A. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but may they who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. 31a, and keep the first half of verse 31, in keeping with the earlier rhythm and blessing established in verses 23 and 24, this poem concludes with a curse on all enemies of Adonai, but a blessing on those who love him. This love is identified in Deuteronomy as the normative, conventional response to Yahweh. This is how you're supposed to be. This is how you're supposed to respond to Yahweh's, to Adonai's grace and his mercy, and how that is expressed toward Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, it's this Blessing and cursing is established alongside obeying in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12, alongside fearing, walking, serving, and observing. So this concluding curse and blessing expresses the belief that Israel's success and the Canaanites' failure were directly related to their relationship to Adonai. And our concluding part of this verse is the last half of 31. Then the land had peace 40 years. That this song functions within the larger narrative account of Deborah and Barak is clear right here with this piece right here. With this, they had land. Then the land had peace for 40 years, where the all it does, this connects this whole thing all together and makes this part of the greater whole. And so this brings to a closure to this account. And this is, well, what this does is this shows the closure to the account of a major judge, is where we'll have this, they had peace for a particular number of years. That's always with the account of the major judge, how they enclose that. And this is just before we have the story of the next story, which begins in chapter 6. So that is our next week's lesson. Will be chapter 6, where we begin the discussion. We begin the story of Gideon, the judge Gideon, with chapter 6. So with this Deborah Barak narrative and poem that's at the end of this, Adonai not only acts on behalf of Israel, but also speaks to them. And here, through this prophetic figure of Deborah, and by the people going into battle in response to Deborah's commission, and Barak going into battle with Deborah's commission, Barak displays some measure of faith, but at the same time the passage tells us of his lack of faith, which leads to him being dishonored, and through his actions, and out of that comes the unlikely foreigner Jael, who delivers the fatal blow to the enemy general. Adonai also acts more directly in this account than in any other. He's by marching as a divine warrior to defeat Israel's enemy, and so we have quite a bit is laid up in this Deborah Barak story. But this God's action in this does not completely discount the efforts of the tribes who braved the fray, nor does it lessen the indictment against those who did not support the coalition. And so this passage, this poem, this whole section here, this story, it highlights the inadequacy of the present leadership model, and creates an expectation of a better future. And as it moves forward, we see that this future model celebrates the Yahweh as the divine warrior role, as God works wonders on behalf of Israel. Well, that is our lesson for today, and I know I went long. I know that went about an hour, and my watch says an hour and 20 minutes, but once I edited this down, it's probably about an hour and 10, 15 minutes. And so I apologize for the length, but we got through the entire chapter. And so bless us for that. That was a challenge. And so the sun is finally moved behind the tree, and I have got direct sun, and so I am happy to say that this is the lesson. This is the end of our lesson for today. I look forward to seeing you, or I look forward to hearing from you and I hope you look forward to the next class. Again, next week, chapter 6 of Judges. So, my friends, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all God's people said, Amen.
God is speaking, God is speaking, do you hear, do you hear? Trust and you will hear him, trust and you will hear him, do you hear, do you hear? Trust and you will hear him, trust and you will hear him, God is love, God is joys, speaking in his wisdom, speaking in his mercy, using needs, using joys, speaking in his wisdom, speaking in his mercy, speaking. Do you hear? Hear his heart. Trust and you will hear him. If you want to hear him, do you hear? Hear his heart. Trust and you will hear him. If you want to hear him, God is love, always love.